Gambling has been a part of sports for as long as there have been sports. The first player banned for life from baseball was George Bechtel, who was fixing games with the Louisville Grays in 1876. The following year, 1877, 4 players on that Louisville team were banned for life after it was discovered they were accepting money to lose games. In fact, the National League in baseball, as we know it today, was created in the 1870s solely to stop gambling from influencing the sport itself. Sports have always been absolutist, though, when it comes to their players gambling. See Pete Rose or the recent suspension of Shane Pinto of the Ottawa Senators. It seems pretty hypocritical, doesn't it? Considering leagues are now expanding to Las Vegas, not for the fan base, which may or may not exist, but to get closer to the sports gambling community, which increasingly pays the bills through commercials and sponsorships and announcers rating ad copy during games. This is what we're going to talk about on today's podcast. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications person at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. For the second time on this podcast, we are going to welcome a Canadian Olympian today. And for, I think, the third time, we'll be speaking with Dr. Steve Joordens at the University of Toronto. Today, we're going to talk about sports gambling, and specifically the advertising of sports gambling, which is now so pervasive that it's almost impossible to watch sports at all without being constantly bombarded with gambling ads. Let's meet today's guests. Steve, we've met you before, so Bruce, you're new to the program, a new voice for our listeners. Let's start with you.
What can I say about myself? I'm a retired professor of sport policy at the University of Toronto. I'm currently the ombudsperson at the University of Toronto. And as one of my part-time interests, I'm chair of the campaign to ban ads for gambling, about which I hope we can talk this morning.
Terrific. We will talk about that. And Steve, our returning champion, let's have you introduce yourself now.
Well, I'm a professor of psychology at University of Toronto. Bruce was actually my boss for a while. He was the head of the University of Toronto Scarborough, where I teach. So I got to know Bruce quite well. Very interested in psychology in general. I was also very concerned when I saw how aggressive a lot of the ads for sports gambling were. And I happened to see Bruce on TV, an old friend on TV, leading the charge against this. And so I was very impressed with what he was doing and reached out to see how, if at all, I could help.
I love that we're talking about this now, and I almost worry that we're at a point where it's sort of spiraled so out of control. Is there any, putting this genie back in the bottle? So Bruce, let's start with you. I mean, what is the goal of your organization, and what do you hope to see happen as a result of your, I would call them lobbying efforts? Would I be accurate in saying lobbying efforts?
Yes. Well, first and foremost, we want the Canadian Parliament to ban ads for sports betting and other forms of gambling the way they previously banned ads for tobacco and cannabis. We want to do that because of the tremendous harm that results from gambling and the way in which the ads groom people, particularly children, youth, and other vulnerable people, to gamble. So the intensity of gambling, the frequency of gambling, the size of bets as a result of gambling, all of these, and the research is very clear on this, accentuate the problems. So you won't eliminate the problems if you ban ads for gambling, but you'll reduce them considerably. And this is particularly the case for children and youth who cannot legally bet, but because they follow sports, because they're taken up by the affirmation, the legitimation, the very favorable presentation about sports betting that the ads present, because they're taken up by the fact that commentators, not paid advertisers, but the sports commentators talk up the bets as they are commenting on the game. They, children and youth, see sports betting as a normal thing to do and find a way into their parents' wallets to get out credit cards, find a way to register for sport betting accounts and become involved. And there is a ton of evidence to show that across Canada, children and youth have become involved in betting. On a podcast not so long ago conducted by the Canadian Mental Health Association, the lead educator for Saskatchewan told us all that she has shifted the target of her educational campaigns about the harms of gambling from grade 9 to grade 1 as a result of the tsunami of ads that we now have about sports betting. So it won't move the problem away, but it'll significantly reduce the incidence of the problems by reducing the ads. And the research from around the world is very clear about that.
No doubt. And I was thinking about this the other day, just because, watching football on a Sunday, watching the Grey Cup, and so much of the league's marketing is geared toward children because they want children to love being at the games and love the sport, take up the sport, become the next superstars in the sport and follow along, have team allegiance for your whole lifetime. And that's what the NFL wants, the CFL, the NHL. But it is impossible to watch any sporting event now. I mean, even, a rugby sevens match that they're showing at 2 a.m. on TSN, you're still going to get sports gambling nonstop throughout the entire broadcast. And I've never considered that those ads would be targeted toward children. Do you think that they are targeted toward children, or do they just catch children up in there, just in the fact that they're so pervasive that children get caught up in it? Or are they targeting them in particular to make them the sports gamblers of the future, do you think?
I'm not sure about the targeting. I'm suspicious of that, but I really don't have any evidence to say that confidently. But I can say confidently that children and youth are taken up with them, and they become socialized, groomed to these betting habits and the idea that betting is a normal part of the game. And I've heard over the course of the last few months, literally hundreds of anecdotes about that. One of the senators who spoke to the private members bill, now working its way through the Senate to regulate ads for sports betting, talked about discussing it with his grandkids. And those grandkids saw nothing wrong with the fact that they were eager to establish betting accounts.
Of course, from a psychology perspective too, we are all psychologists, and we know that the very first learning mechanism, before operant conditioning kicks in, before anything else kicks in, observational learning is the most powerful. So kids watch and they mimic. And when they're seeing a world in which gambling is so intertwined with sports that it's not only seen as a natural part of it, it's often even marketed as the extension, that if you're a real fan, you'll take this next step. So it's almost, marketed as this sort of glowing thing. And if children are seeing this as a normal part of the world, if they're seeing the adults in their life engage in this behavior, absolutely, they're going to be raised without their spider senses tingling, which is sort of the point, I think, here. Like if you're at least banning it, right? Like we do with cigarettes, like we do with cannabis, it's at least society sending a message that says there's something to be careful of here. There's a danger here. Now, maybe you want to, flirt with that danger. Okay, but at least doing it knowing there's a danger. What's so nasty about the way the sports advertising is now is it's just normalized to the point where it's being associated with celebrities and people that these kids like and admire already. They are the people that are talking about the sports gambling. And so while it may not be targeted in the sense of they're really customizing the ad for children, there's absolutely no doubt that children are in the crosshairs. Children are their revenue source for continuing revenue. So they absolutely want to bring them into the pipeline, if we use entrepreneurial terms, and, keep them in there and keep having their money available to them. And, and there's another sort of really tricky aspect to this, which is a lot of the networks. Why is it so entwined? The networks themselves have deals with the sports gambling companies. It's not just somebody advertising on their program. They have become totally entwined. And, I think that sends the absolute wrong message to our children, where we should be signaling, hey, there is danger here. Maybe it's something you want to do. Maybe if you have the finances available and the willpower to do it right, fine, but let's not just make it not just normal, but something that you should be doing if you're a sports fan. And that's how it feels now.
It definitely does. And I mean, you're right. There are a lot of celebrities advertising these things, right? Wayne Gretzky and Connor McDavid, and John Goodman does a lot of them. Kids love John Goodman. But, the one thing that you're talking about, and I think this is something that really strikes me every time I see it. You're watching, let's say, an American sporting event, but you're watching it on a Canadian channel. And the Canadian channel will run their own commercials when we go to break. So we're not seeing the American commercials, but they go to break. And every time they do, there are two talking heads on TSN or Sportsnet or whatever it might be. And all they're talking about is who scored that first touchdown. Did that meet the bettor's expectations? Where are we on the over under? And that's the entire thing. They're not even breaking down the play in the first quarter, in the first period. They're breaking down the gambling odds right. And so that's what seems so insidious to me. Now, Steve, you wrote an excellent blog post where you talk about the weaponization of psychology when these things happen. And I imagine that's what you were talking about earlier. But I'm also thinking that over the years, psychology has been used to advertise absolutely everything that we see on TV. And you were mentioning, cigarettes. We've banned the advertising of cigarettes because we know that that's, very harmful, and that makes sense to do. But we've been talking a lot in recent weeks on this podcast about addictions in general. And, we're talking about decriminalizing, illicit substances that are currently illegal because from a public health perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But when you're looking at the addictive properties of various things, right? You can advertise coffee and you can show people drinking coffee in your ad. You can advertise booze, but you can't show people drinking booze in the ad. You can't advertise cigarettes at all, right? And I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on this weird hierarchy of what we've decided is acceptable, isn't acceptable, the little, limits that we've placed on these things, and where gambling falls into that. Should it be on the cigarette end of the continuum, no advertising cigarettes, the way even if we decriminalized all illegal drugs, we wouldn't be allowed to advertise heroin, right? Would it be on that end of things?
My first response would be that there are authorities, and Steve is one of them, on the seriousness of the addiction involved in these messages and these substances. And to the best of my knowledge, subject to Steve's correction, addiction to gambling is the only non-substance form addiction that is legally designated as such by the American Psychological Association or the American Psychiatric Association. So it has been judged by a slew of experts over time as so serious in the harm that it creates that it needs to be put on a special list of addictions that cause harm. For me, that is the argument for banning these ads. The ads work. Lots of research on that. If the ads work, they increase the amount of gambling and therefore the amount of addiction. They therefore increase the amount of harm. So let's, as a harm reduction strategy, reduce the ads. That's not enough. There has to be other forms of education. There has to be the removal of some forms of sport from the counter of the betting companies and so on and so forth. But first of all, banning the ads is an important step in the right direction.
I would say a couple of things. I think it's first good for us to understand how tricky this is. I go back to, the House of the Rising Sun, 1960s, the Animals, and already a song about the dangers of gambling and then gambling sort of tearing somebody's life apart. But at least in that song, he had to talk about getting on a train and going back to New Orleans to gamble, right? You had to go through some effort and work in order to support that addiction, and it still was supported. Now, we're all carrying New Orleans around in our pocket, right? The casino is right there, and the kids have the casino right there. And so the step for an advertiser to make is a very small one. Literally pull out your phone and just bet. We all know from psychology with random rewards how quickly random rewards can support some behavior and keep it there and make it resistant to extinction. And that's exactly what gambling is. And so, what I would say is, first of all, we need some message. So right now, the message is gamble. The message is just, there's nothing to suggest there's anything wrong with it. At the very least, we need something there to say, hey, think twice. But I'm in agreement with Bruce that I think it's very important that society realizes that psychological addictions can be every bit as nasty as biological addictions. And that includes things like video game addiction too. We're really focusing on sports gambling here, but there are a lot of situations where the use of random rewards can addict somebody into a behavior that negatively impacts their life. And that's when it really becomes a problem in a psychological sense. And certainly we know that's true with gambling. And so to see it just thrown out there as though there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, that has to change. And the most obvious way is to ban the marketing.
You mentioned the 1960s, and actually, I think that song is a traditional song. It's been around for many years before that. I think it was recorded first by Woody Guthrie a few decades earlier. I mean, we've known about this forever, really. And Bruce, I'm curious, though, talking about the 60s, you were an Olympian in the 60s, and I imagine it was an entirely different time to be an Olympian than it would be today, right? Sponsorships and that sort of deal, right? The people that fund your training that manage to put you through into the Olympics. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that from your personal experience. I mean, was gambling even on the radar when you were in the Olympics in the 60s?
It wasn't on the radar. I have one funny story I can tell you about that, but it was not on my horizon in any way at all. People went to the racetrack to bet. I worked for the Toronto Star as a way of earning my tuition because I paid my own way through university. And I worked as a stringer for the Star one day a week, and then in the newsroom, Monday to Friday during the summers. And there were some. It was widely acknowledged that the first edition of the Toronto Star, which sold about 25,000 copies, was primarily to give the people who went to the racetrack the information about those races so they could place their bets. And there was a legendary Star writer, Joe Perlove, who wrote a column. But similar to what Steve said about the casino or about having to take the train to New Orleans, there were probably bookmakers around the city, but there was only one race every 30 minutes.
Right.
And to place a legal bet, you had to go out to the track. Even then, there were people who lost their jobs and lost their marriages and ended up in very difficult circumstances because they overextended themselves in betting. The one story, and it's funny. Many of my races were televised,
right?
But track wasn't a marquee sport, so sometimes they would be televised a day later, 2 days later, maybe a week later. I was in the locker room at the University of Toronto when one of the swimmer, an outstanding swimmer by the name of Tom Wirth, who became an outstanding dentist in Toronto, came down the locker room with a big smile and gave me $10, which in those days was a ton of money. And he laughed and he laughed and he laughed. And he said, I won this in Syracuse last Saturday night in a bar where your race, was on the screen, and someone who knew I was from Toronto wanted to bet against you. Well, I knew that the race was 2 weeks old and that you'd won. So I had no trouble making that bet, and we won. So here's half of what I won. That's my only betting story.
So you started this all.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, but Tom won that because he knew the results, and those races were infrequently televised, whereas today, as Steve said, somebody said the other day that if there are 300 pitches in an average baseball game, you could place 300 bets on pitches alone.
Yeah.
That's the difference from the 60s.
Oh, for sure. And I think you've touched on something there too. This idea that betting was just some sort of camaraderie between friends, unless, right, you had to physically go somewhere to do it legitimately. There were probably bookies throughout the city, but there was something seedy about that we knew that was involved with organized crime. All the major scandals, the Black Sox scandal and all that, like, it comes out of organized crime that would, right? So there was something seedy about it. And now it's so much more mainstreamed. I remember being in Vegas and sitting down at the MGM Grand Casino in the area where they had the sports on TV. And I was absolutely stunned at what you could bet on. It was too overwhelming for me to even think about betting on anything. It was just, like, there's a hurling match happening in Scotland somewhere that you could put a bet on, and it was on the TV here. And I don't even know what that sport is, but I guess I could. Like, it was just too much, right? But now that's it's no longer that you have to go to Vegas to get that. You can get the too much right away. And I think there's something to the power of these sports gambling websites and books and entities that, one, they have the financial capability to purchase basically all the ads and the announcers on all of these major sporting events. That's huge. It also is a testament to how easy it is to make money from the people who are using this app. And I think further that it's almost going a little further now, in that there are some of these things that started out as sports books, maybe for fantasy football or something, that now are advertising that their app comes with all of the casino games as well, right? It's no longer just sports. You can also go in there and you can play roulette, and you can play blackjack, and you can play online poker. And that made me think about online poker, which has been a thing for long time, but never seemed to explode the way that specifically gambling on sports did. And Steve, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe online poker was as serious an issue at one point as sports gambling is now.
Well, I mean, if you kind of think of poker, there's that mix of some level of skill. So, being able to wear the poker face, read other people's poker faces, all that kind of stuff. Plus, there's chance. And when you have that mix, people tend to underrate the chance and overrate the skill. They tend to think, I'm good at doing something. But of course, there's only so many people who know poker very well. When it goes into sports, we are all baptized in sport, and especially the Olympics. I probably watched Bruce, but I was actually born the year after Bruce. Sorry. but I certainly watched, the Olympics. It's a family thing, the Winter Olympics, the Summer Olympics, and sports from young, Maple Leafs, hockey, et cetera, et cetera. And so we already feel like, many of us, that we have some expertise. And now we feel like, oh, I can use my expertise to make money. And what not enough people realize is the point that you just made a little bit earlier. When they figure out the odds, they're figuring it out based on people who know what they're doing, right? It's not like they just have random odds, and if you have some intelligence, you're going to beat the odds. No, they are stacking the odds against the most intelligent people playing against them so that they still win. And now, to the extent you're betting on anything you're not very knowledgeable about, you're way more likely to lose. But the sense that you have a little bit of expertise makes you go into these things feeling like, oh, I know I've got a better than chance rate of making some money here. And, when we talk about where would we like to see things go, I'd love to see, obviously, the ads banned. I would also love to see apps required to have a history so that you could literally see, how much money have I put into this? So some information, and not just these little, hey, you can set your own limits and all these little, things that us psychologists know don't do anything, but literally giving some data back to the person that informs them about their behavior and that maybe empowers them to want to make a change. So I absolutely think the banning of the ads may be just the first step, and that there can be other things we can do to ensure that our kids, especially, because that's when we indoctrinate them in sports, right? Do we want to be indoctrinating them? Do we want to think we're indoctrinating our kids in gambling when we take them to that little league game? Because you kind of are now. And, those two are so entwined. And I think that's why it's so scary.
It strikes me, too, that there's and I don't know if I don't know if this really matters, I guess, in the end, but the hypocrisy of it, right? There's a player, Calvin Ridley, now back with the Jacksonville Jaguars, who was suspended for a full season for gambling. Not gambling on his own team, but gambling, because if you're an NFL player, you are not allowed to gamble. But there's no doubt that the reason they expanded to Vegas, that they moved the Raiders into Vegas, is because that's where the gambling happens. And that's the hub for the whole thing. And it just seems like they're taking the path of least resistance when it comes to all this. Well, DraftKings has a lot of money and they're willing to, put on the Super Bowl halftime show or whatever it might be. We'll take that money. We'll accept that. We'll move to Vegas. We'll move the NHL's move their hockey team into Vegas. Like that. It seems like they're more than catering to the gambling community, that they're actively reaching out to the gambling community to be a part of their sport now.
I mean, that's just how much money is in it, right? Bruce, I think you wanted to jump in.
Well, I can jump in with another autobiographical story since Eric is wearing a Green Bay hat. I once where I was very, very critical of about what I'd read about the gambling in professional sport. And it was a throwaway line. I didn't really have very much data, but I was being very critical of professional sport. And that was one of the indictments I tossed in. One of the other head table guests, Paul Hornung of the Green Bay Packers, passed along a note saying he'd like to meet me in the parking lot after the banquet, that being the, traditional invitation to a fight. And I made a very quick exit out the other way. 2 weeks later, he was suspended for 1 year for his gambling habits. I agree with you entirely, Eric, that there's such a terrible double standard where athletes who act in consistent with the messages they're receiving and bet are penalized, even though the owners, even though the leagues, even though the teams, even though the journalists actively talk up the gambling industry. And it's getting worse, as we saw with the suspension of the Ottawa Senators players a couple of weeks ago. I mean, this is their industry. And yet, I don't think players should bet. And I do worry about the match fixing and the game manipulation that occurs. But if the teams are part of the profit system from gambling, they're sending very, very mixed messages.
And it's even going beyond the team. There's one little story that really scared me in all of this, which is as I started chatting with Bruce and we started thinking, how can we get the message out? How can we make people kind of get excited about this and make sure they're writing to politicians and such, which is what we would really love. I started reaching out to people like I did with you, Eric, and said, hey, here's this story. We would love to chat about it. And in one case where I'm tempted to even name the media source, but I will not. But a news story, a person that I knew from a news story, I pitched the story and they let me know that, our parent media company has a deal with sports betting companies. And this is a major media outlet. And so they were basically saying, we cannot air that segment. We are not going to talk about this issue. So it's not just that this has invaded the sports world and that the sports networks have deals. It's invaded the media world. And the same companies that give us our sports give us our news. And if they are now in bed with the gambling industry, wow, does it, that's just, I know conspiracy theories are not a thing we all love in this modern day and age, but this seems to be, a real concern of, can we even get the message out there? And I certainly hope we can. And I really appreciate opportunities like this, Eric, to do so.
I find that really scary. I find that to be, I'm actually surprised to hear that. I would have thought that despite one of the major sponsors being gambling, that you would still go ahead and run a story because it's a real story, right? I always try to defend the media against the people who say that they make everything up and that it's all nonsense or whatever, because there is a lot of journalistic integrity. But to hear that, does give some credence to the people who say, media is bought and paid for. And in a certain way, that's exactly what you're saying, right? I can't run a story about gambling being detrimental to children because the people who pay for this company to stay on the air are invested in causing that harm to children in a way, right? It's kind of a stunning thing.
And one of our worries is that the traditional media are facing so many financial challenges right now that the money available in these endorsement contracts with the gambling industry is going to skew more and more and more of what gets covered and what does not.
Yeah.
And again, for the average gambler to just kind of pause for a moment and say, how do these gambling companies have this power? How do they have the power to become entwined like nobody else has? How do they have the power to, have media outlets shifting their behavior? They have that power because they have so much money, enough so that Connor McDavid and Wayne Gretzky happily have, little ads that neither of them really need to do. The money must be really, really good. Where are they getting all of this money to have all of this power? They're getting it from you every time you use that app. That's how much of a powerful source of money that is. That's how it pulls money out of people's pockets. And so to stop and think about that for a moment and say, okay, that's what I'm feeding. Do I really want to be feeding that? But that's how powerful the industry is now.
And I was thinking too, celebrities. We just did an episode on addiction and drugs in general. And I was thinking, people like Keith Richards, glamorized for having spent an entire lifetime doing drugs, still being alive. But he's also rich enough to make sure that what he's doing is of a certain quality. And the harms that come are to people on the other end of the economic spectrum, right, where they don't know what's in the drugs that they're purchasing. And I'm wondering if the same is true for gambling. We sort of celebrate some people, Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan, who went to the casino and spent, $800,000 in a night. Ha ha ha, look at that, right? They can afford to do that it's not going to bankrupt them, but it absolutely might to somebody else who's just, starting into this and getting really swept up in it. Is there that sort of economic disparity among the harms that are caused here?
I mean, there's certainly more of a pillow to absorb some of that if you've got a whole lot of money. Whereas a lot of people, the real danger with gambling is people think they're going to come out ahead. And there's that sense that if you're getting yourself into a hole, the more you're into a hole, the more you need to keep gambling. So we already know this with random reinforcements, that they're resistant to extinction. Almost the more you lose, the more you believe that next win is just around that corner. We know that's normally how random rewards work, so they keep you going. But when you're needing the money, when you suddenly don't have enough money to pay the rent anymore at the end of the month, you only got those few $100s left. It's an obvious mindset to say, well, I'm going to have to use those few $100s to gamble to try to get enough to get the rent. And so I think, for a lot of people who start getting into that hole, that can be another driver that keeps them gambling, is the fact that they feel like they need the money. And until they're at an absolute bottom or nobody will loan them another dollar, they have to hit bottom. And we hear that often with a lot of addictions, that you have to hit bottom. So, I think it can happen to a rich person just as well. They probably just have a whole lot more opportunity to get themselves out of that hole before somebody else.
And that's why I love this idea you've had of putting sort of a counter on the app, that you have to see every time you go in how much money you have spent and poured into that over the course of having it. Now, we have just a few minutes left. So, Bruce, I'm hoping you can just tell us about your organization and how people can get involved and whether people can do anything from home. We'll put all of this in the show notes, along with Steve's excellent blog about the weaponization of psychology in this matter.
Well, our organization is Ban Ads for Gambling, and we've got a website with that name that is full of endorsements, research, information about the political situation in Canada. There is currently a private member's bill in the Senate, introduced by Senator Marty Deacon from Ontario, supported by Senator Brent Cotter from Saskatchewan, and that's working its way through the Senate. It will then go to the House of Commons. And we are asking people to write senators and members of Parliament, asking them to support the bill. It is our hope that over the next 6 to 8 months, the bill will be approved both by the Senate and the House of Commons, and then the government will endorse it, and then it will be proclaimed by the Governor General and become law. But to ensure that, people have to write their senators and their MPs. So that's all we ask. There's a letter on our website to enable them to do that. It shows them what the addresses are. That's not everything that needs to be done, but that is an important first step.
And if I could just add a couple of things to that. So first of all, we're older letter writing type people. For the younger social media post people, I've heard that if you include the title of the bill or the name of the MPs in your posts on social media, that they have people working for them that scour the internet for such mentions. And so that's another way of having your voice out there, talking about it, spreading the word to other people. I've got my 1,800 student class right now creating public service announcements. There's a hashtag #WeTheOutcry, which is a response to a magazine article that says, hey, this gambling is going crazy. Where is the outcry? Our class is trying to be the outcry. So hashtag #WeTheOutcry. We're going to post their PSAs with that, or they will. And anybody that can just talk about this on social media, get the talk going, reference those MPs. Again, you can find it all on banadsforgambling.ca. Reference the actual bill in your discussions, and that alone will let the senators know what you're feeling, what your thoughts are, and will help the cause.
The bill is Bill S-269.
All right. We will put all of this in the show notes. So for anyone listening now, you can just go to the show notes and take a look at all of these different links and hashtags and the social media campaigns. Thank you both so much for appearing on Mindful, brought to you by Bodog Sports. Joking. It hasn't invaded the podcast space yet. Now it's still all Squarespace and Kind Bars and Bombas socks and whatever, right? One day we'll have a sponsor. It's not going to be a sports gambling company. Thank you both so much for being here and for speaking with me today. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric.
There really is no respite as a sports fan from the continual normalization of sports gambling. Even the ads that warn about the dangers of gambling do so in a tepid way and redirect people to the same gambling sites that are causing the issues in the first place. You remember when cigarette ads were banned, but ads for smoking cessation showed people smoking in a glamorous way and may well have encouraged starting to smoke before they encouraged quitting? Kind of like that. It's going to be a tall task to take this on, but it's important, and Bruce and Steve are doing the work. Thanks to you for listening, downloading, streaming, and reviewing today's episode. If you'd like to get involved, check the show notes for the links to Bruce's organization and to Steve's blog and social media campaign. Mindful is written, hosted, recorded, and published by me, Eric Bowman. It's produced and edited by Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.